this may not be very interesting, not at all. But I'll start out and try to tell my
Is it on?
life story. I see the sparking.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm starting out with saying that I am the granddaughter of Johnny and Josie Borland and George and Ollie Rankin. And I'm going to say that my grandma Borland was born in 1961, 1861, pardon me. And also my grandpa was 1860. And I don't know for sure just when Grandpa and Grandma Rankin, but I never did really know just how old they were, but they're somewhere in the category of Grandpa and Grandma Borland. Also, my great-grandfather Rankin was lived, and he donated the land to the Lone Elm Cemetery. And they named it the Rankin Cemetery. It is still there, and it's in use. A lot of people still buries there. And I was born, and my parents was Walter and Lois Rankin Borland. And so I was born the oldest child of them, and I am in May the 5th, 15th, 1915. And I was born in a log house, double log house, with a big hallway in between the two houses, you know. And I was way out in the country, about 3 miles from, I'd say north of Lone Elm. And lived there until I was about old enough to start the school. And that's where Paul started school, also born and started school. And so I was almost 3 years older than him. And I also had a brother that was born in between us that was in Graphic, Arkansas, that he died when he was just an infant. And so we lived there in Lone Elm and moved up to a place where we called it our old home place. We lived there probably 6 or 7 years, and that's where we went to school, and we went to church there. We just had a 2-room schoolhouse and one big room in the church house, and had everything, all our church and social gatherings at the church house. And so we just grew up with the normal childhood, I guess you might call it. We was a church-going family, and my grandpa Borland, of course, was a Baptist preacher. And so he'd go around to different places and preach. And my dad always said that he had to quit school when he was just a boy. Because Grandpa would go off and preach, and he was the oldest boy, so he had to stay at home and farm and take care of the grandma and the kids that was home there while Grandpa Borland was gone. So he didn't get much schooling. My mother was a school teacher, and she taught school, I guess the summer before they got married in September. And she taught the elementary grades, from the 1st to the 6th or something like that, or 7th. And so when they got married, and that's when they moved up to the place where I was born in. And it was just, then we moved down to, we finally moved to California when we lived there on the old home place. We lived there. So we moved to California and stayed there 4 months. And of course there wasn't any place that looked as good as Arkansas, so we came back to Arkansas. And then we moved down there on the place where Annabeth was born, and they're by Lone Elm again, and we lived there 3 or 4 or 5 years maybe, and she was born there. And we still went to school at Lone Elm, and my uncle Francis Rankin was one of my teachers, and my uncle Raleigh was also a teacher, but they didn't teach at the same time. My Aunt Thelma, she was a school teacher there part of the time. And so we just all, went to, and he was my teacher, Uncle Francis was, and so we went to school. We lived close to Uncle Ron and Aunt Lou at Lancaster. We walked to school with Carol and Cecil and Floyd, and 2 or 3 more families that had kids along the road there that we'd walk to school with them. We had to cross the Mulberry Creek, or the little Mulberry Creek that run down through there below Nelum, and he had a footbridge across there, and it was a swinging footbridge, A lot of times in the winter it would be slick and sidling, and we couldn't hardly walk there at all. And the boys would get on each end of it and shake it up and down, and that was hard to walk, I tell you. And we'd get so mad at the boys that we couldn't hardly stand it. But the years passed, and so we just, of course, we lived out in the country, and we just tickled us to death for Mom would wake us up early one morning, some mornings, and it was going to town, and had to run the wagon. It was 7 miles from Lone Elm to Mulberry, and so we'd go over there and we'd stay all day with Grandpa and Grandma Beulah, and Grandpa worked in a store, in a general store, and where they sold all kinds of stuff, might near everything. And so we'd stay all day at Grandma's, and then we'd come back home in the wagon. We'd have a good day. We'd all went to town and stayed all day long, happy as could be. And so each time went on, and I was about 13 years old when we moved to Wagner, Oklahoma. I had an uncle and aunt, Dean and Lily Smith, that lived in Wagner, and they got after my dad to come out there and farm that year. Well, they had some good farming land out there, so we moved out there and stayed a year, and he farmed. And only in that fall sometime, Joe Sangster at Earlsboro got after him to move down to Earlsboro and live on one of his places, because he had struck oil, and he had a lot of money, so he had bought spent his money in buying up land and stuff. And so he had a place down there, and so we moved down there, and we lived there, I guess, about 3 years. And then Mom and Daddy moved up to another place, and that's where I met Robert, though. He's down at that place, and so we used to.
Oh, no, it's hard to remember those things.
So but we didn't know each other for a long time. You know, we didn't really know each other. We didn't run in the same crowd, not like that, but they had the play parties, they'd call them, or country dances, or whatever, and so just a bunch of young folks would gather at people's houses. And Grandpa and Grandma Montgomery was a great hand to have them together at their house, and so we'd walk down there, Cecil and Floyd and Carol and I, and sometimes Paul would go with us, walk down there and do the parties, and so it was a whole year, I guess, or maybe longer than that, till Grandpa and I became conscious of each other, you might say, on Halloween. On Halloween night, well, I just want to have a dance at one of the neighbors down there, and so he said he always picked cotton and done fall farm work to earn money to buy his Halloween clothes, and he dressed up in Halloween clothes. Nobody would know who he was. That's what he always said. And so he came to the dance that night. Of course he had his mask on his eyes and stuff like that. And so he's shaking hands with everybody. Of course, nobody knew really who he was. And so he shook hands with me. He says, hello, Miss Moreland. I said, well, hello or whatever, you know. And so then, but I wasn't with. I forget how I got down there, but I wasn't with him. Anyway, we didn't start going together then for probably another month or so. Finally, we began to going together, and it was 13 months, I guess, that we got married. And so, of course, we as happy as we could be, of course. Just 2 kids, you might say. He was 19, and I was 16 and a half. But of course, we ran off and got married, and my mom always said after we done it, you'd all told me I would have bought you a new dress. You know? But I always wondered if she really would have or not. You know.
Making all the fun out of it.
Anyway, he had asked me if I would marry him a week or so before we did, and so I said I would, and so him and he borrowed the Northeast car and took Grandma Brown and Hazel, him and Seppo took Grandma Brown and Hazel down to Aunt Minnie Rose at St. Louis, down close to Maud, and to stay 2 or 3 days. So during that week, he had went and bought the marriage license, and so he asked Norby if he could borrow the car, and what he going to do, and Norby said, well, it's because you want to or because you have to. And of course, he said because we wanted to.
Had those questions been there.
And so that sounds just about like Harvey, because you want to or because you have to. So that him and Zelpho took Grandma Brown and Hazel down to 8 Minnie Rose, and then they come back. And Buford, Uncle Buford, and his wife Gladys lived about 1.5 miles south of us there, and so they went down to Buford's and stayed until that night, and they came back by and got me, and of course I told Mom and Daddy that I was going to a party, so they didn't have any idea what was happening. So we went down to Maud, close to Maud, to Elmer Birdsell's, and he married us. He was a Church of Christ minister. And so we come back, and it was got married at 11 o'clock on the 4th of December in 1931. And so we came back and stopped by Mom and Daddy's house, and Mama said she knew something was wrong just as soon as I asked him for a match to light the lamp. Come in the house. It's dark, of course, and they was in bed about 1 o'clock that night. And so she knew there was something wrong then, and so they got up, her and Daddy did, and come in the front room, and they sat down there, and we told them what was what and everything like that, what we'd done and everything, and then we went on up and took Norby's car to him and walked the rest of the way about 1 mile, I guess, on up to Grandma's house and some Zelpho, and went in there, and Grandma didn't know what was up either. Anyway, she started telling Zelpho where we could sleep, and Robert said, "Mama, this is my wife." And she turned and Grandpa, this in the bed and in the front room. They had the bed in the front room. She said, "Dad, did you hear that?" And of course he said he did. And of course then we all went to bed that night and got up the next morning. And of course Grandma and Aunt Blanche and there was 13 of us there whenever I went to live there. 13 of us, and those you can see why she made big biscuits and stuff like that. And so we went in the kitchen to eat breakfast and everything, and of course they was the friendliest people you ever saw. They all hugged and kissed me like I was one of the family, and everything like that, and just made you feel like you was one of them. And so that day for dinner, Uncle Tom and North and Violet and their kids all came up there for dinner. We walked down to Mom and Daddy's that night and ate supper, and stayed 2 or 3 days down there before we went back to his folks' house. He'd rather lived up there as to stay at Mom and Daddy's, because he always felt like his daddy didn't really like him very much. Because Robert had the name of being a renegade or kind of a wild young man. But they didn't know him, everybody just, everything that went on in the country, well, they laid it on to him, everybody did. And so, because he was just run with kind of a wild bunch of boys, And so he always felt like that Daddy didn't really like him much, but he didn't like to stay up there too much. But we did stay up there a lot, and him and Paul and Daddy would cut wood, and then we started to make a crop there with him that year, with Daddy that year, and decided we didn't want to do that, so he got a job at working at farm work up at the man by the name of Mr. Howard's. He earned $3 a week, and he always gave him Mr. Howard gave him I don't know what you call it, credit card or whatever for groceries. He didn't pay him in cash. He gave him a card or a thing to buy groceries at town, so that's what we do. But I was aiming to say that when we got married, he had worked for a week or so and had $3, and our marriage license tells $3, and he had a quarter left over. He had a quarter left over. So that year though, we worked out, and he worked out for farm work for different ones and made $3 a week all year long. And then starting of the next year, then we made a crop there where my mother and Daddy lived, and they moved up on the barrack place about a half mile north of there, and so that's where Barbara was born in August in 1933, and so she was just well, the morning she was born, it was hot summertime. It rained all night the night before, the 31st of July that year. It just rained like everything, but the sun came up clear as it could be the next morning, as hot as it could be, and so Daddy rode over to tell Grandma and Grandpa that we had a little girl, and so Grandma came back over there, and of course they all made trips back over there, and they was all saying what they wanted us to name her, if it was a little girl or a little boy. They all had talked for 2 or 3 months where they wanted us to name it. And so we decided on Barbara Louise before the doctor left that morning. And so asked him what we named her, and Barbara Louise. Well, they all said that's just what we wanted to name her. Just exactly. And so she was good. She was a good baby. She wasn't bad or tall, but she's so afraid that something had happened to her. I'd turn the cover back to see if she's still breathing. I guess I thought she'd die or something like that. And somebody says, "You don't be careful, you're gonna look all the pretty off of her." But we just stayed there that year and at that place and farmed and made a crop. And I don't think let me see. The next year he got a job working with the truck patches with Mr. Chambers, and so we worked up there. He worked up there. I didn't do anything when he only kept the baby and stayed at home. But we always had to move. We moved about every 6 months at that time, and we lived back and forth with his folks and my folks every week or two or a month or so with different ones. And let me see. During all this time, my mom and daddy was still up on the Barrett place, and when Barbara was born, Annabeth was just getting ready to start school that fall, and so she come carrying her little pillow then for Barbara to lay her head on, because she kept it all the time, so she'd give her a pillow to lay on. But when we went to work with truck patches for Mr. Chambers, he went to making a little more money, but not very much more. But we still moved around every once in a while. We worked there the year of 1934, and then in the fall of 34, I think, Robert and Harvey thought they'd go to Arkansas, Truman, Arkansas, to make their fortune. They was going to work for their cousin, Fred Whitlatch, down there. And he was one of these kind that had big plantation farms and all like that. So I sold everything I had there at Earlsboro to get money for Barbara and I to go on the train down there to Truman. And we had a heifer calf that was been a cow in the end of the year. We had some chickens and all, but the ticket those days wasn't very much. And so we went on the train down there. So we found a place to live down in Arkansas, and and Harvey and Exie, they went and they lived in part of our house. The first few years we was married, they lived in part of the house, and we lived in the other part. And everywhere that we'd moved, well, they'd move, and they'd get the back part or the front part of the house, and so we lived there 5 months, and it wasn't much better than Oklahoma was, and so we got homesick, of course, and that was in the spring of March of '35, and so we came back. The Harvey Nexus stuck it out till October of that year, and we came back to Grandma and Grandpa's and to Mom and Daddy's and lived there back and forth till he got a job again with the truck grower, Mr. Chambers, there that summer, and worked there until fall. And we moved. He quit his work. I forget what he was doing at that fall, but we was living with my mother and daddy, and that was the year that Milne was born. And it was a pretty fall. Reminded me of this fall, it was pretty and cold, and it turned cold, and Daddy would help my mother and Daddy dig sweet potatoes and pick up pecans, because they lived down in the bottom where they had a lot of pecans. And so the night that Milne was born, of course we had to go out to the doctor, and he lived at Earlsboro, And so it was just it was the blusteriest night you ever saw. It rained and the wind blew. It come a blizzard. It turned cold that night. And the next morning, and she was born it was about 3:30 on the 31st of October. And of course, the next morning, and she weighed 6 pounds and some odd ounces. She wasn't a very big baby. And that morning, Robert and Barbara got on the horse and went over to tell Grandma and Grandpa that the baby was here, And so here come Grandma over here. She always come right over there and to see how everything was and everything. But they rode a horse and over there. It was just as blustery and cloudy as it could be and turned cold. But we stayed at Mom and Daddy's then until she was, probably 3 weeks old, where we thought she was able for us to take her over to his dad's and mother's. And that was in first part of November, sometime in November we went over there. And then that year is when we rented the place over here south of Tecumseh, Miss Sisney's place. And I think it's in the 28th of December that we all moved down on Miss Sisney's place south of Tecumseh. And we farmed there then and lived there. We lived there 3 years. No, maybe we lived there. Moved there in the spring of 30, winter of 35, and spring of 36, and moved away from there then in, 3 years, I guess. It was 1939. And Grandma and Grandpa lived right over across the road in the hill from us, and that's where Aunt Blanche died. And she died in the year of 1939. So, the range line was, we lived on the range line. And down there about a mile south of us, the range line had a big open place in there that anybody could live there because it didn't belong to anybody. It was just belonged to the state. So Robert came up with the bright idea of buying a house that needed tearing down there around Juanette or somewhere down in there, and moving it up there and building it in the range line. So we'd moved down there in the winter of 1940. And so him and Buford and AC went down there and tore the house up and hauled it board by board in a wagon up to that place in the range line down there about a mile south of Miss Dixie's place, and built a house, a 2-roomed house, pretty good sized rooms, And so we had to, and we built it and moved down there in January, about the first part of January in 1940, and that's where Vera was born, and the 26th of January, and the snow had been there for about a week, as cold as it could be, and everything like that, but that's where she was born. And
Where was Linda?
Linda was born on Miss Dixie's place, in 1937. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was born there too, and so that's when Harvey and Zelpho and Emma and Bill was married in the fall of 1937. And so let me see. Robert got a job working for Mr. Jarvis that done farm work and all kinds of work over there. That's when we moved down there on the range line. But he worked there for a year. And then we moved to Seminole County and lived down there by Seminole. His cousin, Willie Earls, owned a place down there. And so we moved down there and farmed one summer. And moved back. He was moving all the time. Seemed like every 2 or 3 months we'd move.
I'll never complain.
Oh my! Don't never complain of moving.
I'm ashamed of it.
And it's a job. And during this time, Harvey and Exley had moved down to Seminole County to Willie Earl's place too. So we moved in the same house with them, only in different rooms. And Exie was always, I don't know what was wrong with her. I still don't know what was wrong with her. She may be a little bit more mellower than she was then, but she never did like me very good, and she never did like Robert. They just didn't like each other somehow or another, but she always never could get along with her very good. But
they always lived with you?
my near all those first years.
Still.
And you know, they just didn't like us at all. I remember,
They must have liked something.
I remember when we moved out of Seminole County, AC helped us move. Well, we got down there in the evening sometime moving, and of course he couldn't have time to come back home in the wagon and everything like that, you know. So he stayed all night with us and was gonna go home the next morning. He lived up here south of Tecumseh. And you know what? Exie had already moved a trunk out in the doorway between the rooms, so nobody was going to dare get in the other rooms of her house. And AC started to open the door and go into her rooms, and there that trunk was, right in the doorway. He said to say bye to them and get ready to go home. And she already had that trunk moved up in the door, but she wasn't going to let anybody in there. I don't know what she thought we'd ever do. I don't know why we'd even more in her rooms without letting her know we was coming. But anyway, we lived down there in Seminole County all that summer, and Robert farmed and helped Willie Earls with his things that he had to do. And Willie Earls was Daddy's cousin, you know, was Grandpap's sister's boy. But so we moved back up on Mr. Jarvis's place and helped him. Then he worked for him. Then that was about in September that we moved back, and he worked for him then from September till January. And during that time, Ralph Gwynn, he was a man that lived down there around Ruggles, and so he asked Robert if he built him a house, would we move down there and help him farm his land? And he just lived about a mile south of there, right close to Ruggles. And so we did. Ralph built us a house with 2 rooms in it again. And he had a lot of good farming land, and so we farmed there 2 years, I guess it was. And then we moved down onto Miss Solomon's place, and that was right close to Ruggles. And that's where Marilyn started the school there. And that was, Barbara was already in the 3rd grade. But, and that Glenda started we lived there from 1942. That's where Ruth was born, at that place, at Miss Solomon's place at Ruggles. She was born in 1942, and that's where I really got acquainted with Miss Ida Brooks and their family, because she cooked at Ruggles School. That's when the free lunches began coming out, the free lunches at that time, and she cooked. And so we got acquainted with each other. And she wanted to take the kids, Marilyn and Barbara and Glenda, home with her and keep her. Always, Ruth was going to come, you know, so keep them that night. And so we let them go home with her that night, all night, and she brought them back the next morning. But then I've known the Brookses then, ever since then. It's been nearly 50 years, and close to it since I've known the Brookses, and they was really good people. But we had just good years down there, and hard times with poor people, but it's all poor. It's all just scratching for their living, you know. And so that's when Robert was called into the Navy. We wondered what in the world did me and the 5 little girls have to go off, but there's a lot of married men had to go to that war. A lot of them did, and a lot of them didn't, but a lot of them did. That had as many dependents as he did. So in the year of 1944, that spring, he bought a place there in West Walnut there in Tecumseh, and that's where we lived while he was going to the Navy. And he had to build a room onto that house because it wasn't big enough. He just had 3 small rooms, one right behind the other, and he built another room on it. And he was gone 20 months, and would just come back 2 times, I guess, while he was gone. And that's where Karen was born. Of course, we didn't know the 6th was on the way when he went. He went in March. He went in April, and she was born in December. And so I had a yard full of kids back there all the time playing. And our kids got acquainted with everybody around there, you know, and they just played and everything like that. I would never let my kids go anywhere. But I didn't care for the kids being in my yard to play with them, because I knew where my kids was at that then, you know, they was playing with the neighbors' kids and everything. But some of the neighbor women would say, "Oh," says, "your husband will never come back. He'll never come back." So he knows he's not gonna, he's not gonna come back. It'd be 2 months sometime before I hear from him. You see, and he'd be out on the water, or the mail plane wouldn't get to him right, or something like that. But you just have to keep faith and know good and well that that's not so, and stuff like that. Just have to keep it going. And then he come back in 1945 in December. 19, he left on April the 5th, 1944, and he got home on December the 3rd, 1945. And he just come home 2 times during all that time. And so he went back to work at the OK Packing Company. I forgot to say, at Ruggles, he got a job. That's where he first got the job at OK Packing Company, making $12.50 a week. And we thought we was flying. We thought we was getting rich. Hamburger meat 10 cents a pound, lunch meat about 25 cents a pound. Well, we just getting rich, and got us a radio. Exactly, just flying high. 12.50 a week. And so he finally got raised though to 18.50 before he went to the Navy. He went to driving a truck, and they raised him to $18.50 a week. And so he'd have to leave early before daylight in the morning, wouldn't get home sometimes till 9 or 10 o'clock in the night. We had cows to milk and farm work to keep up, wood to cut on the weekends.
Is that where we left when you misread the clock or something, and he got to work at about 2 or 3 in the morning?
And that's where we moved back over over to west of town.
Oh.
And yeah, that's
I thought it was
after
down
that.
there.
Yeah. No, but we'd have to get up early, and then I'd have to do the work at home. But we'd cut wood on Sunday, enough to last up all week, and then on Sunday again, we'd have to go cut wood again. Sunday was our wood cutting day. Leave the kids at the house. But they never did get in the fire or anything like that. It's one of the good if they hadn't, but we never did warn them. And it seemed like, I think that's one reason they didn't. They didn't think about getting in the fire. Because we didn't warn them to stay out there now. You'd get burned or whatever. We'd always put wood in the stove enough to last till we get back at noon. We always come back to eat dinner at noon. But then he did get this job, work with the packing house, and then that's what he got when he came back from the Navy. He got his job back, and they raised him $37.50 a week. And that's what he made for a long, long time. After that, he worked at the packing house, and then we lived there in town until August of 1946. And we bought this place farm out there west of Tecumseh, and moved out there and lived out there 8 years. And he farmed part of the time, and he worked at the packing house part of the time. He worked for Elton Ivy part of the time. He worked with Joe Frank Harden part of the time, and just different things, And we just, then the county commissioner, Alan Stepp, never would do anything about fixing that road out there because he didn't like Colonial Raider. And so he wouldn't help Colonial anyway, and so he wouldn't help anybody down that road. And he wouldn't fix the road from the main road to our house. The bridge had washed out one time when a big flood had come. So he never would fix that, so we just always had to go down and around to the pasture and up through the house nearly all the time. And it was so bad. It would just wear a car out. It was so unhandy. Finally, after we stayed there 8 years, we liked the 11th of August to the 25th, to be staying there 8 years exactly. He finally sold Ed White, lived had a place over west of us, wanted to buy our place, and so he finally sold it. Didn't look like there's any hopes that he was going to keep his job in town, and we couldn't make it out there all the time, the way the road was and everything. So we moved to town, right where we live now. And that's where I've lived ever since, 35 years, last August. But during that time, I've lost him, I've lost everything I had, but I thought the world was coming to the end and all like that, but it hasn't. And still trying to make it, and I have got my kids and my grandkids, which is a joy to me. And I love them everyone, but if But I guess that's about all. If y'all think of something to ask me, I'll try to answer it.
Well,
I didn't have anything but hand-me-downs. Things that my aunts and cousins had outgrown, and they'd send them to me because they knew I was next in line. And Mama would take them and she'd redo them, do them over, hem them up, or fix them whatever I need to be done. So I had a navy blue dress. It was straight in back, but it had a circular skirt in front. It was real pretty. I thought it was real pretty. With a tan collar, a big tan collar down here, all around the puff sleeves. Pretty, but it was just a hand-me-down. But that's the kind of dress I got married in.
what day was?
Oh, he had a striped tan and with blue striped pants, and there's kind of bell bottom at the bottom. That's kind of when the bell bottom came in style back in those days. And he had a kind of a tan striped and a striped shirt, and one of these vests, like he was kind of a
And he always wore a hat.
dapper young man. Yeah, well, he wore caps at that time. Cap with a bill on it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he always done that back in those days. He was probably 25 or 30 years old before he went to wearing a hat. Then he wore a hat and khakis. But well, I guess we lived a normal life. Had a lot of ups and downs and everything like that. But nothing.
Did you tell about when Jerry was born?
Jerry was born on yeah, and there was Doris
And Doris was born
Debbie
over there?
And Bobby.
All there.
Yeah, you see, Jerry was born. Doris was born in 1947. The year after we moved over there, in January after we moved over there, and she was born in this blizzard, cold weather, snow on the ground,
Remember that.
10 degrees below zero.
Mm-hmm.
The morning she was born, just cold as it could be. But and she wasn't a very big baby either. I guess she weighed probably 6 pounds or a little over. And we lived there then. Jerry was born in 1949, in February of 1949. And it was almost, a snow had just got over with then. And
You
it
never
was still
learned about
cold.
these winter babies, did you?
I sure did. And time was hard, and water, you had to draw water out of the well, and he'd fill the car up with fresh water when he started out of the morning, and he'd drain it out just as soon as he gets where he started, and then fill it back up every when he get ready to start. And that way, he never did freeze up, but he kept water all the time drained out as soon as he stopped, And then all this time though, he'd put back to work for the OK Packing Company. Well, he was working at Elton Ivy's at the time Jerry was born, so they let him off all that day, a little Saturday morning. And he went in to take the doctor back. He stayed all night with us that night, and to take the doctor back home. And
Was that Dr. Campbell?
And of course they was all wanting to know about what it was and everything like that. And he said it was a boy. Well, you can just have the rest of the day off. And so he came back home, and Grandma Kate was there, and so she stayed in until, well, he took her home later that evening, and my mother was there too. She stayed because she lived over just about half a mile west of us. Yeah. And then in 1951, well, here come Debbie. She was born. She was a little bitty baby. I don't guess she weighed much over 5 pounds. She was little, tiny, and she was born right in the middle of the summertime, in August 21st, in 1951. And that's the year that Barbara got her job with the Morris plant at Shawnee, and she'd ride with Robert over to Tecumseh, and then she'd catch the bus to go on over to the Morris plant at Shawnee to work, and then she'd come back over and ride back home with him. That evening, I asked her how did she like the baby's name when she came in, and she said, "I think it's the sweetest little old name." She had brought me a aluminum coffee pot that day, and that's how long I had that coffee pot before I got this one I've got now. Almost 35 years, almost as old as well, the same day that Debbie was born. That's when she got it for me, and I kept it all these years and used it a lot.
How could you throw it away?
I didn't throw it away. I've still got it in the bottom of the cabinet.
No.
I didn't throw it away. And so then but she was a little baby, and the wind was hot coming through the bedroom windows in there that it blistered her little skin. It was so
Just
tender.
peeled off.
It was peeled off. It was just, it was so hot, and her skin was so tender. But then in 1954, then in 1953, why Barbara and Gerald got married. And all this time your mom and dad was going together in this time. They got married then in October of 1953. And so we had two of them to get married that same year. And so Barbara said she didn't want anybody to go with her to the wedding because she was afraid they'd cry. Well, we didn't push it. We didn't go to her wedding. I wished I had 1,000 times that we had went, but she didn't want anybody there. Afraid they'd cry. And then when Marilyn and H.J. got married, she wanted to get married to Grandma, but she didn't want the whole caboodle, the whole family to be there. But Grandma invited everybody, all the family.
On our side.
Yeah,
None from
and
the
nobody
Linden's
but H.J.'s side. None, just
We didn't know he was invited till we got there.
just his mother and dad was all that was came of his folks. And every one of Marilyn's folks was there, you know. So, right near every one of them. And so, but they got married there at Grandma's house, and then that was in 1953. Well, in 1954, why Bobby was born, and he was the only one of my kids that was born at the hospital because the doctor had died.
It wasn't that you got tired or anything.
Not because he had a heart attack.
I don't know how you did all those.
Oh my goodness.
Did you have long labors?
Oh
I mean, was it
yes.
bad?
They wasn't
I
none
can't
of it easy.
imagine.
They wasn't none of it easy. Some of them was over 12 hours. Some of them was probably 18 hours, and some of them was probably 8 or 10. Just not long. But Bobby was the only one born at the hospital. But Bill and H.J. was good enough to come and help out for a few days after when he was born with the other kids at home, you know, while I was in the hospital and while I was getting better. And so, but then in 1954, here come Paula in October. Here come Paula Carroll.
You know every grandchild's birthday.
Yeah.
Everybody's birthday.
Is it?
And it's just about out.
All
What
right.
would quit